Hi everyone, I'm Mike. This is the Sunday Art Show, and today I'm going to be working on a work in progress from around about 11 or 10, yeah, I can't remember exactly, 11 or 10 years ago maybe, not quite sure. Anyway, this is the beginnings of a painting of a couple of Highland cattle, and this is based on a reference photograph that one of my friends Martin kindly sent me and said, hey, can you make something of this by any chance? Is it of any use to you? And I did end up doing a mixed media drawing from this reference photo. I'll see if I can find that for you. But then this is about as far as I got with the painting. So I thought, well, let's finally get back to it and see if I can finish things off. This has been created so far with conventional acrylic, just a very simple treatment of the sky, the background. You can see I've put in some blue brushwork, just gestural lines to block in the drawing of the two cattle, and then a little bit of brushwork with this kind of beginning of a reddy brown colour on both. Now I'm actually thinking of leaving this one here almost completely untouched, probably do a little bit more work on the horns, and then I'm going to work up this guy here to full detail. So I'm going to be using some Atelier interactive acrylics for the next stage. This is conventional acrylic on the painting so far, and I've got two patches of tinting white, some alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow light, burnt umber, and French ultramarine blue on my palette so far. So what I'm going to do to begin with is mix up a little bit of a mid orangey brown. So starting with a good amount of the cad yellow, just using a flat synthetic brush here. It's around about 3/4 of an inch wide. And let's get a bit more paint. So good amount of the yellow, and just adding a little bit of the alizarin crimson in. Let's get a bit more red. And perhaps just a touch of the burnt umber. And a touch of the ultramarine blue. And the first thing I want to do, just grabbing a little bit of water for the brush, first thing I want to do is look at this head with fresh eyes and correct some of the lines, where appropriate. So let's look at the line we've got across here. So that's not too bad. And we've got hair falling over the top of the head, which I'll come back to in a moment because that's quite light, but I just want to outline it a little bit. And then, so the colour I've mixed up now isn't actually too far off what I did, 10, 11 years ago, so that's kind of cool. Glad I can still mix colour, or I'm not, how can I put it, my colour mixing isn't deteriorating too quickly, that's the thing, I guess. So now, the head's a little wider here than I had it drawn. And kind of comes down here a little bit more. Same on the other side. So it looks like I kind of exaggerated or caricatured my drawing a little bit. So that's kind of made the head a more realistic shape. And then I'll start looking around to see where else I can use this same colour. Now, the ear can be the same colour, and I can just refine the shape of the ear there a little bit. And let's look at the other ear. Similar thing. So they've got wonderful ears, these animals, so hairy and fluffy. So that can come down there a bit more. Perhaps a little bit more there. Now let's look at the body. So the drawn stuff isn't too bad, I don't think. Could bring in some darker area there. And then if I use my brush to measure from my reference, the bottom of the chest area is about the same height as the head, so it's not too far out in my original drawing, so that's okay. Just need to come down a little bit more here, and that's there's quite a steep line there, and around here. That's all okay so far. Just need to mix up a little bit more paint to add some more of this colour over here too. All right, well, I've mixed up some more of that same colour, or what I hope is the same colour, and oh, it's a little too yellow, so I'm just adding a little bit more of the alizarin into the same mix. That's a bit more like it. I also sprayed the surface of the painting with water. It's quite warm in this room today, and consequently the paint was drying out a little bit more quickly on the paper compared to what I wanted. So for that reason, with these interactive acrylics, if I spray them even when they're sort of touch dry, this paint that I put down earlier, it's still active. I can still blend it if I want to. All right, so that's more or less. Let's put a little bit of that same colour there. Okay, so that's more or less all I need to do for this mid-tone. What I want to do next is I've got a good patch of the colour here on my palette, and I'm just going to spread that out a bit, and you'll see why later, hopefully. I'm going to pick up some of the tinting white I've got. I've just added that into the mix. Just going to mist the painting once again with the water, and then what I'm hoping is this can be the beginnings of a highlight colour, but by keeping the acrylic active, I'm hoping I'm going to get some nice blending effects going on. Now this colour I'm using at the moment won't be the brightest of all the highlights I do, but it's just the beginnings. So for example, over the top of the nose there, put a little bit on the ears. And this layering of paint also helps to begin to cover up my drawing, which I did with paint as well, but I don't actually mind too much if some of those early lines show through in the original painting, in the finished painting, I should say. So I'm just looking at areas of the animal where the hair is sorry, I've got a bit of a tickle in my throat, that's why I keep stuttering when I'm speaking, where the hair is a bit lighter. Now I just put some of the red brown over the top of part of the horn there. That wasn't actually intentional, but it'll be okay because I'll cover that up later. All right, well, once again, I'm going to take a little bit of that mid-tone I had, put a bit more of the tinting white, a little bit of the yellow this time, a bit more of the white, and once again a quick mist with the water bottle. And now let's put in some brighter highlights. So many of the areas I apply this colour to will be very, very similar to the areas I just went over, but with some exceptions. So just going to put a little bit of that there and a little bit at the top with a gap in between on the bridge of the nose. I'm going to come back and address the mouth and everything separately. Okay, and then one more go, but this time almost all tinting white. But I didn't wash my brush. I've just kept the same color on the brush. And let's grab a little bit more of the yellow, and we'll see what that looks like. Let's want to keep things fluid, so and not too many harsh lines at this stage. So again, keeping the surface of the painting moist. And then we can apply these lighter highlights, and hopefully at the same time, because I'm working wet in wet, some of my brush strokes are going to start to convey a sense of texture. We've got a hairy animal here, so it's going to be fairly subtle at this stage, but we're starting to introduce that kind of effect. Okay, so now I've switched to a slightly smaller flat brush, roughly half an inch wide. I've still got this mid-tone here mixed up, but I'm going to add some ultramarine blue to that and some alizarin crimson. Let's get a bit more of that. And some of the burnt umber as well. And this is going to be the beginnings of my shadow colour for the same animal. So once again, keep the surface of the paint fairly moist, and then if I squint at my reference, I can start to introduce some shadows. And because I'm working wet in wet, you can see I can kind of blend and soften some of the edges that I put down. So if I was using conventional acrylic without a slow drying medium, then you can still do it, but you've got to work pretty darn fast. And I find with the slow drying mediums, they don't dry quick enough. So the advantage with this is, even though it's wet in wet, it will still dry pretty quickly, touch dry. So if I want things to stay where they are, then that happens pretty quick. If, however, I want to reblend, then as you've seen, I can add some more water with the spray, and away we go. Now the feet of this animal are just out of frame, and I don't know that I did that by design 10 years ago. I honestly can't remember, but I'm quite happy, whether it was an accident or not. I'm quite happy with that, because it kind of feels as if the animal is sort of stepping right up to the viewer and saying, what are you doing here? Why are you in my field? So as I'm painting away here, I'm not really trying to draw legs or, stomachs or ribs or anything like that. I'm just, for the most part, squinting at the reference so that the detail goes out of focus, and then I'm looking at the animal as a series of abstract shapes. For the next step, I've just dragged my brush through a clean paper towel, and now I'm mixing up a 50-50 combo of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. There's probably slightly more burnt umber in there than the blue. So again, just misting with the water, and same flat brush. Just going to use this colour to do just a little bit of line work here and there to get some of the really deep shadows. Now, when it comes to the eyes at this stage, I'm not really going to try and draw an eye. I'm just going to try and draw the shape of the shadow that I can see in the eye area. There we go. So we've got the presence of some eyes suggested there. Now, when we come down to the mouth, again, if I squint, I've got quite a large area of deep shadow there. And then it's dark underneath the chin. And the brush isn't really small enough to do the nostrils, but again, we'll just begin to put the nostrils in roughly the right place, and I'll come back and refine that later. Now the paint is still quite wet, so that's okay. And in terms of the main body of the animal, that's pretty much all I'm going to do for the moment. I need to let that dry a bit more, so while that's going on, I'm going to work on the two horns. So having cleaned my brush, my first step towards working on the horns is I'm grabbing some of that first light tone that I had, and I'm going to use that to just block in the horn on the left. And then we'll use that same colour for the opposite side. Now the horn here actually comes out a little bit further than I'd originally drawn it, so that means my original line is somewhat incorrect, to say the least now. But I can either choose to completely hide that line later, or I can just say, well, okay, that was the initial measurement, and I may decide to leave that showing because it does sort of convey a sense of movement as well, I think. But anyway, for now, what we're doing is grabbing quite a lot of the tinting white and putting that onto the same brush. I haven't cleaned the brush at all, and I'm going to use that to begin to lighten the horns. And then with the same brush, you know, barely cleaned, just used the paper towel, grabbing the ultramarine blue and some alizarin crimson. And let's put that into, yeah, that's pretty good. Putting that into that pale shade that I had from earlier. And let's put some of that colour onto parts of the horns as well. Mostly at the ends. And then actually what I can do, I've just realised, this wasn't actually my initial plan for this colour, but I can probably use some of that. Let's make it a little bit darker than what we just used on the horns. So if I look at the nose, I can put some of that colour in there. Now obviously I'll need to add highlights later, but that's beginning to go in the right direction in terms of colour for this area. And while I've got that colour on my brush and this animal's drying, I want to address the horizon line because it's fairly soft at the moment and I'm quite happy with that, but I think I can probably just, if I grab up a ton of the tinting white and mix that into what I've got on my brush at the moment, that's probably still a little bit too dark, so let's just bring that, what's left of the brush, into the tinting white. And I don't know whether I want to change it actually. I quite like how raw that sky is, so on second thoughts perhaps I won't even touch that. Yes, I'm just pondering what to do with the background. So I decided to leave the background for now, but what I did was I took that colour I had and just mixed it in with some of the dark purple I had that I used here on the nose. So that's kind of created a deep brown, and I'm going to use that, kind of a greeny brown. I'm going to use that to put in a little bit of a cast shadow. There's not, you know, the light is fairly diffuse in my reference, so that there's not a strong cast shadow anywhere in particular, but things are still going to be slightly darker underneath the animal compared to the surrounding grass. And what I'll do is, just so that doesn't look too out of place, we'll just, with the painting fairly wet, we'll just blend some of that colour in across the foreground. We even put a little bit of a cast shadow in under this one. And perhaps begin to hint at some of these long, I don't know what they are actually, long grasses, just long reeds that are growing in the field. And then next I've just realised I want to darken the bit of the tail that's showing, so I'm just going back in with the dark colour I had earlier, already mixed up, and we'll just suggest the presence of the tail there. And then I think I'm going to let that dry completely now, and then we'll come back and refine things further. Actually, I've just realised that while that's drying, one of the things I can do is take the pale purple I mixed up earlier, and I can use that to paint in the horns on the second animal over here on the right. Now, as mentioned, I don't plan at this stage, at least, to work this animal up in any great detail. But nevertheless, you know, what I do put in there, I want to be reasonably accurate. So regardless of the drawing I had before, I seem to have made the same mistake on both animals, actually, that the horn on each animal that on our right is not long enough in each case. But nevertheless, we can still go ahead and, you know, correct that while we're here. I'll put a little bit of tinting white along that top edge. Same along there. Little blip on the tip of each of the horns. Oh, that's way too much there. Oh, that's not bad. Now I've used my finger. Then I just need to clean my brush. And with a fairly dark purple mixed up with the blue, the crimson, and a little bit of the mid-tone I used on the first animal, I can just add some shadow to the horns here if I'm careful, and if I use the brush edge on. And in fact, I think I can probably use some of that colour on the left over here as well, just to strengthen some of the shadows. The painting is now completely dry, and I've refreshed my palette. Coming in with a small filbert brush, I'm going to start to add some more detail to the head of the main animal. So just grabbing some of the tinting white, some cadmium yellow, and we'll grab a little touch of the crimson. A little bit more. A little touch of the burnt umber. That's perhaps a little bit too much. But we'll see how that works for an initial highlight colour in terms of, you know, beyond what I've done already. So we've got this lock of hair which is cascading over the top of the head and over the horn on the right. And I'm just going to grab a bit more white, which I know is too bright for that area, but I just want to kind of lighten it in general, and then I'll maybe redarken it in a moment. We'll see. And let's grab a little bit more of the pure yellow. Now when it comes to the colours I'm using, you know, I still want this to look like a Highland cow. I'm just adding a little bit more of the alizarin to my mixture and a little bit more of the white to my original mixture there. But, you know, I don't mind deviating from the true colours quite a lot, actually, if I feel it's going to work overall for the painting. So now. There's quite an array of hair, you know, quite sort of stray hairs working their way down across the head. Not going to try and capture all of those, but we'll just put a couple in for now at least. And then starting to pick out some of the highlights within the main locks of hair. And I don't have to copy the pattern exactly. The main thing is to just create some highlights which start to suggest a texture. And you know, they also act as contours. So if I paint these correctly, then it will help to make the three-dimensional head more convincing as well, because if you look at it and think, well, hair, you know, would fall that way over that particular shape, then it just tends to make things look more 3D. So far that's not too bad. Let's add a little bit more of that colour here. I almost want a little, you know, I haven't gone quite orangey enough, I don't feel. So I've just grabbed some cad yellow, some of the alizarin. As it turned out, I added way too much, I think. So let's grab a lot more of the yellow. And we'll use some of this on top of some of the very pale colour I put down a moment ago. And what I can do is mix in between that sort of darker orange patch I created and the lighter orange, just to begin to pull out highlights in different areas. But it's going to allow me to make my highlights slightly different colours, or slightly different in colour, I should say, as I move across the head. So you want to try and avoid putting in highlights which are just a single colour, because you know they rarely are just one colour. So again, notice how I'm keeping my brush strokes in line with the contours of the animal's face, but also when I look at my reference, you know, the hair tends to grow in line with those contours anyway. So you know, hairy animals are quite good in that sense. They provide you with ready-made contours. Okay, so now I can start to do a little bit more modelling around the nose. So it's a lighter patch of colour there. And then that continues around each side of the nostril. I'm going to have to repaint the nostrils in just a moment, but we'll get to that. Comes down here. And then, so I've been using this lighter one, and like I said, I can just dip into the adjacent slightly darker colour when I want to. Add a bit of that slightly darker colour there. Now let's go darker again for, it's not quite dark enough, so I'm going to add some of the burnt umber to my mixture. Okay, so we've added some reasonable highlights to the head. And having added some of the lighter details, I now want to add some slightly darker areas. So starting with some ultramarine blue and adding some alizarin. Now I know that the colour I'm about to put down is basically wrong for the animal in question, but I think, you know, adding a little bit of purple into the shadows, it tends to work quite well for my paintings, I feel. So let's see if it's true for this one. So I've adding a little patch of shadow there and there as well, and then now that shadow's cut into the highlight here. So I'm just going to see what happens if I smudge that with my finger. Let's see what happens. And the answer is not very much. Okay, that's not too bad. We can come back and fix that later. Now, I've already got the area of dark shadow for the eye, but I can kind of enhance part of that. And also just to the left of that main shadow as well. There's also a dark area down here. And I'm sort of feeling that for that area the shadow is a little dark, so again I'm just smudging it with my finger. So I'm going to add a bit more of the crimson into this purple, and I'm also going to pick up a little bit of that colour I mixed up before. So I picked up some of that, and we'll see how that looks. I think what I need to do actually is, you know, I'm smudging with my finger so much. I think the problem is the surface of my painting isn't quite wet enough. So, as usual, just using the water spray to keep things a little more fluid. And then let's use this colour to put in a quick line there and there. Darken some of these areas on the left hand side of the head. Make the mouth a little more open than I had it. And darken some of these areas on the ear on our left. And then this same colour I can actually use on the horns again as well. So the main thing I need to increase on the horns are the brightness of the highlights, but nevertheless I'm still going to just darken a couple of key areas. And staying on the horns, I've switched to my little 1/2 inch flat, and I've just got some pure white on the brush at the moment, and I'm just using that, as you can see, to brighten up some of the highlights where the light is catching the horns. Now the surface of the painting is still quite damp, so that means that you know, I'm not putting down too thick a layer, and the paint moves reasonably fluidly across the surface, so I'm not getting too harsh a highlight basically. Now what I tend to do is switch back and forth between working on, I did quite a bit of detail there, some of it needs to be softened and corrected, but having done that and looked at things in quite quite close up, now I'm kind of going back to the way I would work at the beginning and thinking, okay, if I squint at the animal, what needs to be adjusted? And there are a couple of things. So the highlights need to be adjusted in colour. So I'm coming back in with my my white, a little bit of the yellow, picking up some of that pale colour I had mixed up before. And that's probably a reasonable starting point. So again, if I squint at the reference, I can see that the area here needs to be a little brighter. Just going to keep the surface of the painting fairly moist. And then here on the back, we need some brighter highlights. And having given that broad treatment to the highlighted areas, I now want to do the same for the slightly darker regions. So just grabbing some alizarin crimson, my brush is still fairly damp, it's got a little bit of that light colour left on it. And I'm mixing that into that purple I had before, a little bit of yellow as well, I think. And let's see how this works to just gently darken some of the areas where I need to kind of punch up the shadows. So this is, I'm effectively doing a little bit of a glaze here. So in other words, I'm hoping some of the texture that I've got in the painting already is going to show through the layer that I'm putting down when it's dry. Now what I'm applying now is essentially the same colour, but it's got a little bit more blue in it. And now hopefully, although I'm keeping the surface of the painting fairly moist, I'm hoping that the detail work I've done on the head is dry enough that it will withstand me applying a little bit of this wash. It's not really a wash, I suppose. It's more of a glaze, isn't it? But again, even as I apply this, I'm still mindful of the direction of the brush strokes. Now, as I'm working away here, I'm effectively obliterating some of the original nostrils that I put in, and just softening some of the colour and mixing some of the colour that I put down a moment ago. And then when this is all dried back, I'll be able to go back in and add some further details. Now the rear hooves, I just want to hint at with a little, this is just ultramarine blue mixed in with a little bit of the purple I was using a moment ago, and a little bit of white as well. So I just want to, to be honest, they're barely visible in amongst the grass, but I just want to finish off the bottoms of those rear legs, really, just to show that they are there. And then the next thing I want to do is introduce some more of a reddish hue. It's a little bit purple and orange at the moment, which is fine, but there needs to be a bit more kind of rust red in there. Again, keeping the surface of the painting slightly wet, I've mixed up a little bit of alizarin crimson in with some of the tinting white and some of the yellow to produce this. It's an almost pink colour, and I'm just using this now to soften some of the boundaries between the very dark areas I've got and the lightest areas. And what I'll also do is use this to introduce a little bit of subtle texture and some very subdued highlights, for example here in amongst the deep shadow region. So I'm really just almost dry brushing over those areas, and we can pick out some brighter highlights later if needed. So I'm still keeping in mind the direction of my brush stroke, because then if I just sort of flick the brush at the end, I get little wispy bits here and there. It just helps to convey that sense of hairiness that obviously these animals have. You don't want to overdo it, but you don't want a completely smooth outline either. And we can leave little gaps between the brush strokes that I'm putting down at the moment, because again, some of the work I've done already, it just helps if little bits of that show through here and there. Right, so now I'm going to let that layer dry as well. Now, as mentioned earlier, at the moment I've got this, it's almost like just a green wall really behind the animals. But I quite like the roughness of the sky and the horizon area. So to help introduce a sense of distance and depth, I'm just going to put just a very, small little indication, almost a silhouette of an animal up on this horizon line here. So that way I'll have 1, 2, and then a sort of a triangle point back here, 3. So it's going to be very subdued. So I'm just grabbing some of the colour I had mixed up before and mixing it in with one of the lighter colours. And we'll see what this looks like. Just gone back to my little filbert here. And all I want to do really is just put in a little line for the neck there. And then here's the back of the animal coming across here. The hindquarters. So the painting's a little bit too wet for what I want to do, but I think it's in some ways it's going to help because it's going to keep the paint that I'm putting down quite subdued, but in other ways it's almost going down a little bit too transparent. But what I've tried to put in there is there's an animal there grazing, so its head is pointing down that way. Now, what I'll probably do in a bit, I could perhaps even try that now. Let's see if I grab some of this darker colour I've got here, because I'm going to be working wet in wet. This might give me the effect I want. So I'm putting a little bit of shadow down there and up under the neck, and then some under the belly as well, and some here. And what I'm going to do is just let that dry, and we'll see how effective and convincing that is as a distant animal. It looks like on camera, it just looks like a little splodge of paint at the moment, but as I say, we'll come back to that. Now, the other thing I want to do is leave this untouched, but I want to lighten some key areas of the foreground. And to do that, I've switched to a reasonably frayed 1-inch flat brush. I've just got a little bit of light purple and white on the brush, and then I'm dipping that into the white to refresh it here and there. And then I just want to add some texture, but I'm going to try and keep the marks that I'm putting down kind of going in lines this way to kind of define this sort of flat plane of the field that the two main animals are standing on. And my hope is that by adding these highlights, without touching this stuff, it's going to kind of create a foreground which looks flat, and then it's going to be, just something else, maybe up on a hill off in the distance or something. So I'm varying the way I'm applying the paint. Sometimes I'm, like at the moment, I'm just kind of scumbling the brush. Other times, some line work like I'm doing now. And as you saw earlier, I was just tapping the brush like this before. So it's just to introduce a little bit more of a sense of light in the foreground. Let's grab a little bit of the yellow as well. Okay, so that's starting to have the desired effect. The main animal's reasonably dry now, so I'm going to come in and add some more opaque highlights. So this is just titanium white mixed up with the blue, and back to my little filbert brush. I need a little bit more white in there. So a bit of a highlight on the nose. Let's just lift off some of that, and then that carries on across the top of the nose, above the nostrils, over to the left side. There's also a little patch of highlight here, and again on the left side as well. Now, this same colour I can use to put a little flick in there on the lower lip. And across the top of the lower lip there. A little bit of a gap, and then another touch. Then if I mix it with just a little bit of that pale glaze colour I used earlier, I'm just going to add a couple of touches in here where the tongue is just showing. Yeah, I don't need to draw the tongue, but we're just kind of suggesting that there's something in the mouth there. Maybe soften some of that a little bit with the finger. There we go, that's a bit more like it. For the nostrils themselves, I've mixed up approximately 50% blue, 50% burnt umber. And that creates a very dark colour. And then as I'm applying that dark colour, that's kind of removing some of the rough edges to the highlights that I had there. And then beyond that, beyond the nostrils, I can continue some of this very dark shadow down here, up under the top lip, and the corners of the mouth. Coming into the eye now, and being a little bit more precise than I have been so far, I can put a very dark central region in on the eye. And I can even leave just a little hint of a highlight by not painting over a small patch of colour that I put down earlier. So that's kind of automatically created a very dark, subdued highlight in the eye, because the eyes are for the most part in shadow under the long hair. Same colour still. I can just add a line of very dark shadow under this left hand horn. And I'm just going to add a little bit of red to that same mixture, just so that I change the colour I use a little bit, going from one side to the other. Now I've got a little pale line here between the horn and the ear, and that's not quite how it is, but I quite like the effect. So I'm just going to put a little patch of shadow above that, and then skip along to this part of the right hand horn and darken the underside of that. So continuing with that same reddish colour, I'm going to put a couple of little lines of shadow in on the ear, and then underneath this lock of hair on the right. Perhaps a little touch here. That's probably enough of that colour. So I've added some more yellow and red to the mix. And let's see what this looks like. That's a bit of a brown really. That's created, at least that's how it appears on when I put it down on top of the colours I've got. But that's okay, because I can use that here under the eyes. So the paint I'm applying now, I'm barely mixing it with any water at all, so it's going down in a much more opaque way. And if you've seen any of my recent portrait videos on the channel, you may have noticed that I tend to start out by putting down a broad blended colours, and then towards the later stages of the painting I kind of put little patches of opaque colour where I feel it's appropriate. And so I'm kind of doing the same technique with this main animal in the painting. So it's a way of putting down detail in a reasonably loose way, so I can still look at the animal as a whole. I don't have to get too obsessed by zooming in on one area. And I feel it's quite an efficient and expressive way of creating form, and it gives a nice balance between a sort of blended approach and a more impressionist approach, I think. So you get these sort of two layers to the painting to give you a combined effect. Just going to add a little bit more red to the mixture. The other thing I like about this technique is you almost go back to, you start off a painting, or I start off a painting typically by drawing, often drawing with the brush, and then it goes to, if you like, a pure painting stage, and then I come back to drawing at this stage. The next step, just added some more yellow to that same colour I just applied. And again, I'm going to go round, even though I'm going to be going over some of the work I did a little while ago, it's very much a step-by-step process. Not everything I do, works, first application of paint. More's the pity. Up until this point in the painting, I've been using tinting white, but I've actually just switched to titanium white for some of these highlights I'm going to put down now, because the tinting white is great for, as the name implies, it kind of tints, it gradually lightens things, but it's not quite as opaque as the titanium white, and I kind of feel I need a little bit more punch to some of the marks I'm putting down. So that's why I've changed. So this is just a light orange mixed up with the titanium white, the alizarin crimson, and then the cadmium yellow. Still using the filbert. I'm just working my way around the head using the filbert edge on, almost like a little knife, and just cutting in key highlights here and there. Move over to the left ear. So just like when we draw, we can often use a hatching technique to layer the little marks we put down. You can do the same, with your painting as well. So I put down these rather larger blocks of little patches, little highlights, little shadows. But there's no reason you can't put another brush stroke over the top of that, obviously, but in kind of a crisscross pattern, or just a one diagonal over another. So as I'm working around or across the animal, I'm still squinting at my reference, looking for the main patches of colour, and I'm still applying just these brush marks, following the contours, following the general direction of the hair, but I'm certainly not trying to copy every single hair that's present. Yeah, and I'm not putting marks everywhere there's a highlight, just trying to capture the main areas where the highlight matches the colour I'm using reasonably well. Didn't clean my brush, but I did mix into it some more titanium white and yellow to give me a highlight which is brighter again. Now, I don't think these particular cattle comb their hair in the morning, so I've got to be totally careful not to fall into the trap of following the same lines that I put down before. So it's absolutely okay to have highlights crisscrossing, you know, in weird directions over the mid-tone. So having established the general contours, that will still show through. So the odd highlight at an opposing angle is okay. You can get away with that. I've just put a little bit of the warmer highlight over the cool highlights that I put down before. Again, it's important to just kind of consider balancing warm with cool, dark with light. And even though these colours aren't really present on the horn, I'm going to put a little burst of yellowy highlight in there, there, and there. So a little bit of pure titanium white here now. But I'm being careful to break up the line that I'm putting down as the highlight. So notice I've gone white, gap, white, and I'm going to put a rather larger block of white on top there. So what that's done is I've now got, you know, multiple components to my highlights, because I've got the tinting white underneath with the blue in that I put down earlier, and then within that I've got a rather more powerful pop of pure titanium white. So again, line, gap, another little line, a little bit up here on the end as well. And then I'm just grabbing some of the paler kind of orangey brown that I put down before with some of this titanium white. Just trying to get the mix right. Just put some of that in there. In the same way that I kind of went round putting on these little marks of highlight, I'm now going to do the same with some deeper shadow colours. So this is a purple mixed up with ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and also some burnt umber. So it's a nice strong colour, suitable for shadows, but it's not as deadening as, you know, a pure black or brown would be. And in fact, if you look closely at the animal's coat, there are little hints of a very subdued purple. You know, I've kind of enhanced the colour. So once again, even though I'm at the fairly late stage in the painting, I'm looking at the reference. You know, it's zoomed out. The computer screen is probably about 4 or 5 feet away from me, so I'm not zooming in, looking at key details. I'm very much looking at the animal as a whole, and looking at my painting and thinking, well, you know, want to be inspired by this animal, but at the same time I'm thinking about what I need to do for the painting as well. Just put a little very thin line under the tip of the horn there. And again, for the eyes, I can darken even further, or not so much darken, I guess, but just add a little more vibrancy to the darkest parts of the eye, especially the one on the left. But we'll put a little touch in on the right there as well. I've taken that purple and mixed it with a little bit of the tinting white again, so I've switched back to the tinting white. I'm just using that to refine the shape and the shadow a little bit on this animal we've got off in the distance here. And again, I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail, but I want basically no detail, but I just want it to look like it might be part of the herd. So that's enough for the moment. Now with just titanium white and some yellow, I'm just going to use that to tidy up some of the silhouette I've got here. So the line of the back isn't too bad. This part here isn't too bad, although it needs a little correction, but I'll do that in a moment. And then again, not too bad, but it needs a little correction. But the main thing I want to correct in terms of the first move is the outline of this rear leg, which is, it's pretty crude at the moment. So that's worked reasonably well. Now obviously that's created a rather strong boundary next to the animal, but we'll compensate for that in just a moment. Now this leg here, I'm going to bring up, tidy up there, and then what I'm going to do is add some patches of this strong yellow colour, break up a little bit that line with my finger. So we'll introduce some hints of grass there, and then I can use that same colour to refine the shapes of the front legs as well. So front legs were rather better, but the shape got a little bit lost as I was painting away. So can come down more like that. And in doing this, the other effect that's going to have is it's going to tend to darken, well, not literally darken, but it's going to tend to make the shadows look darker. So we're effectively enhancing the contrast. So let's continue some of this bright colour across the full width of the painting. I'm even going to put some here. I've added some blue to the mix, and so I'm going to use that to just adjust the silhouette of the rear end here. So the belly, so the leg comes up here, belly comes up there, and now that I look again, I actually see I've made things far too big there. Yeah, I think that's helped quite a lot. But again, in doing that, I've created something of a silhouette, not a silhouette, sort of just a hard border around the animal. So what I'm going to have to do initially is I'm just going to spray some clean paper towel with some water, and I'm just going to break up that line of paint I put down by sweeping through it at various different angles. And that's actually creating a fairly interesting little effect. Actually, haven't done that on an animal before. We can soften the outer edge of that halo as well. So this is one of the great advantages with the interactives. If I'd done that with normal acrylic, it would be over, basically. Nothing I could do. I'd have to paint over it, in other words. So I've added some more yellow to the mix, and I'm just going to use some of that yellow down there, a bit up here, just to kind of break that up a little bit. And then while I've got that on the brush, just add a few quick flashes here and there. Break up some of the other outlines I put down a moment ago. And I've added some more blue to the mix, so I'm going to continue to break up those little corrections that I made. So the correction will still be in place, but hopefully it won't be quite so obvious that I put a line around those areas. And we'll continue that colour across the painting so that it doesn't look too out of place. And then I'm just grabbing some of that purple I had and mixing it in with the green I've got on the brush. And we'll use that to just, if you remember earlier, I did put in kind of a bit of a cast shadow down here. And I just want to, some of it's still visible, but we can use that to place the animal on the ground. And I'll put a little bit of that here on the cast shadow on the second animal, again just to keep a coherent colour scheme across the painting. Now the green little highlights that I put down here and here, I don't mind it there, but here I seem to have miraculously matched that green to almost exactly the same colour that I put down 11 years ago. So it's making the horn look transparent. So I'm going to make that highlight a little more pink, tidy up the animal at the back, and then I think I'm going to be pretty much done. All right, well, I changed the highlight color here, as you can see, and here as well, but I did leave just a little burst of the green there. The cow, or the steer off in the distance, I actually obscured in amongst the trees, and I just hinted at some field lines and some trees off in the distance as well. I decided the animal up on the horizon was just a little too much of a distraction, I think, and I probably need to do just a little bit more work to completely hide him there as well. So let's take a close-up look at the finished painting. Hope you enjoyed this painting of Highland cattle. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.